Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In December 1861, Britain prepared for war with the United States. 11,000 British troops were dispatched to Canada. Royal Navy steamships were placed on alert. In London, war plans were reviewed for the first time since the Napoleonic era, not against France, but against America. One decision in Washington had pushed the two countries to the edge. 50 years later, British and American soldiers would fight side by side in Europe. Their navies would coordinate across the Atlantic. Their economies would be bound together by debt, industry, and survival. No peace treaty had declared friendship. No moment of reconciliation had ever been announced. So the real question is not when Britain and America became allies. It is when fighting each other stopped making sense. After the War of 1812, the United States and Britain did not part ways as reconciled enemies. They separated as rivals who had learned restraint. The war had ended without decisive victory, and both governments understood that another conflict would likely end the same way: expensive, inconclusive, and politically damaging. For the United States, Britain remained a looming threat. The Royal Navy controlled global trade routes. British influence persisted along North America's borders, and memories of maritime coercion were still fresh. Independence had been secured, but vulnerability remained. American leaders assumed that British power would eventually have to be challenged or contained. Britain viewed the situation differently. The former colony was growing rapidly, but it was not yet a strategic peer. Trade with the United States was profitable, and another transatlantic war offered no obvious gain. Britain's priority was preserving its global empire, not reopening a costly conflict over a former possession. Economic reality reinforced this restraint. American raw materials fed British industry, while British shipping and finance underpinned American commerce. Severing those ties would damage both sides. Political suspicion persisted, but it was constrained by dependence. This produced an uneasy peace. Diplomacy functioned not because of trust, but because disruption carried risk. Each government assumed the other would act in self-interest if pressed too far. Peace rested on calculation, not reconciliation. By the early 1820s, the United States began to test how far British restraint extended. It would assert claims not just about independence, but about authority, claims that challenged how Britain had long operated in the Western Hemisphere. In 1823, the United States issued a declaration that sounded like a warning, but functioned more like a test. The Monroe Doctrine announced that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization and that any new imperial expansion would be treated as a hostile act. It was a statement of intent delivered before the United States possessed the naval power to enforce it. In London, the reaction was measured. British policymakers understood the imbalance immediately. The United States lacked the fleet to challenge Britain at sea, and enforcement of the doctrine would depend paradoxically on British naval dominance itself. Yet Britain also recognized that the declaration aligned conveniently with its own interests. British influence in Latin America was commercial, not territorial, and reopening colonial competition offered little benefit. What followed was not confrontation, but calculation. Britain chose not to challenge the doctrine, not because it feared American retaliation, but because resistance would cost more than compliance. Trade with the United States was expanding, and stability in the Americas served British merchants better than renewed imperial rivalry. Ignoring the doctrine required no sacrifice. The two sides interpreted this outcome differently. In Washington, the lack of British opposition was seen as validation. American leaders believed they had drawn a line and watched a great power step back. In London, the doctrine was treated as rhetoric, useful but conditional. Britain had not conceded authority, it had postponed a decision. This quiet divergence mattered. American confidence grew faster than American capability, while British tolerance remained voluntary and reversible. The underlying tension had not disappeared. It had merely been deferred, waiting for circumstances that would force both sides to reveal how much the doctrine truly meant. Those circumstances arrived not through grand policy, but through regional disputes that exposed where American claims were real and where they were aspirational. The next test would show how power, not principle, shaped the boundaries of restraint. The gap between American ambition and American capability became clear in the decades that followed. In 1833, Britain reasserted control over the Falkland Islands, a remote territory in the South Atlantic. The United States objected diplomatically but took no further action. The distance was vast, the stakes were low, and the U.S. Navy was not in a position to challenge Britain over a dispute so far from American priorities. A different calculation emerged in the Pacific less than a decade later. By the early 1840s, Hawaii had become central to American trade routes and strategic thinking. When the United States warned Britain against interference in the islands in 1842, the response was notably restrained. Britain stepped back, not because it feared immediate conflict, but because American interest was concentrated, credible, and likely to intensify. These two episodes revealed how the Monroe Doctrine actually functioned. It was not an absolute rule, but a selective one. Where American interests were peripheral, enforcement was absent. Where they were vital, pressure was applied, and Britain adjusted accordingly. Power, not principle, determined the outcome. For American leaders, this inconsistency was instructive. It confirmed that influence had to be demonstrated through action, not declarations. The doctrine could protect areas the United States cared deeply about, but only when backed by growing capability. For Britain, the lesson was equally clear. The United States was no longer a former colony to be managed casually. It was becoming a regional power whose reactions required serious consideration. What mattered most was not who prevailed in each dispute, but what did not happen. Neither confrontation escalated into violence. Each side chose restraint over assertion, even when irritation was real. A habit was forming, one in which disputes were absorbed and managed rather than allowed to spiral. By the middle of the 19th century, this fragile balance faced a far more dangerous test. A war inside the United States threatened to draw Britain into a conflict it did not control, forcing decisions that could shatter the restraint both sides had carefully maintained. When the American Civil War began in 1861, it immediately placed Britain in an impossible position. The conflict was internal, but its consequences were global. Britain had abolished slavery decades earlier and publicly opposed the institution, yet moral clarity offered little guidance in a crisis defined by economics and power. British industry depended on southern cotton. As the Union blockade tightened, mills across northern England slowed, and unemployment surged. Food prices rose. Social unrest loomed. In London, the war was not an abstract moral struggle. It was a direct threat to domestic stability. Sympathy for the Union competed with pressure from industrialists who wanted trade restored as quickly as possible. At the same time, Britain had no desire to fight the United States again. The memory of the War of 1812 lingered, and the stakes were higher now. The United States was larger, richer, and more industrialized than it had ever been. Recognition of the Confederacy was discussed in British cabinet meetings, but always alongside the same question: was Southern independence worth a transatlantic war? That question became urgent in December 1861. An American warship stopped a British mail steamer and seized 2 Confederate diplomats, the Trent Affair. In London, the reaction was immediate. 11,000 British troops were sent to Canada. The Royal Navy placed steam-powered warships on alert. For the first time since Napoleon, Britain seriously prepared for war with the United States. The crisis ended only because Washington backed down. President Lincoln's government released the diplomats, recognizing that holding them could push Britain into the war. Britain accepted the concession but did not forget the lesson. Restraint had nearly failed, and the margin for error was shrinking. When the Civil War finally ended, the guns fell silent. But the danger did not. Britain and the United States had avoided war by chance as much as judgment, and as the armies disbanded, a new weapon replaced the cannon, a financial claim that threatened to turn wartime grievances into peacetime crisis. The end of the Civil War did not close the book on Anglo-American conflict. It shifted it into a different arena. The United States emerged victorious but deeply scarred, with a navy that had spent 4 years chasing Confederate raiders across the world's oceans. Many of those raiders had been built not in the South, but in British shipyards. The most infamous was the CSS Alabama. Constructed in Britain and released under the cover of neutrality, it went on to sink or capture dozens of Union vessels. To American officials, this was not an accident of diplomacy. It was evidence that British restraint had failed when it mattered most. When the war ended, Washington was determined not to let the issue fade quietly. What followed was not framed as revenge, but as accountability. The United States demanded compensation for the damage inflicted by British-built Confederate ships. Britain initially resisted, aware of the precedent such a concession could set. But resistance carried its own danger. Relations were fragile, and the memory of how close the two nations had come to war in 1861 remained fresh. The dispute was eventually sent to international arbitration. The outcome stunned many observers. Britain agreed to pay $15.5 million in damages to the United States, the largest international compensation payment of its time. In today's terms, it would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. It was effectively the most expensive apology Britain had ever issued. The significance of the payment went beyond money. It signaled that Britain was willing to accept legal responsibility rather than risk political confrontation. For the United States, it demonstrated that pressure could succeed without force. The dispute that might have reignited war instead reinforced a new pattern. Grievances would be absorbed, not escalated. This did not create friendship. Suspicion lingered, and neither side trusted the other's intentions. But something had shifted. The idea that disputes between Britain and the United States should end in war was quietly losing credibility. Britain, in particular, was beginning to feel the weight of a world that demanded its attention elsewhere. As old conflicts cooled across the Atlantic, new pressures were building closer to home, pressures that would reshape how Britain viewed the United States in the decades ahead. By the late 19th century, Britain's greatest challenge was no longer the United States. It was the strain of managing a global empire in a world that was growing more competitive by the year. From India to Africa to the Mediterranean, British forces were stretched thin, and new industrial powers were beginning to test the limits of British dominance. The United States benefited from this shift in British attention. As America focused on industrial growth and continental consolidation, Britain's priorities moved decisively elsewhere. London was less concerned with managing relations across the Atlantic than with countering Russian pressure in Asia and maintaining stability within its own empire. The absence of direct conflict between Britain and the United States began to feel normal. That normalcy was tested in 1895, when a border dispute between Britain and Venezuela suddenly escalated into a diplomatic crisis. The territory in question was remote and economically insignificant. What mattered was the American response. The United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine and demanded arbitration, presenting the dispute as a challenge to American authority in the Western Hemisphere. Britain had the power to refuse. It chose not to. The cost of confrontation outweighed the value of the land. Accepting arbitration preserved stability with a rising industrial power at a moment when Britain could not afford unnecessary conflict. The decision was quiet, but its implications were profound. The arbitration ultimately favored Britain on most substantive points, but that outcome missed the larger story. By agreeing to American mediation, Britain implicitly acknowledged U.S. leadership in the region. The Monroe Doctrine, once dependent on British convenience, now rested on American credibility. This episode marked a psychological turning point. Britain no longer treated American influence as temporary or symbolic. It treated it as a fact to be managed. The United States, in turn, had demonstrated that it could assert authority without provoking war. As the century closed, the two nations were no longer drifting apart. They were adjusting to a new reality, one in which rivalry across the Atlantic mattered less than the threats emerging elsewhere. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain's strategic problem had become painfully clear. It could no longer defend every corner of its empire with equal strength. Industrialization had produced new competitors, and none concerned London more than Germany. A rapidly expanding German navy now threatened Britain's traditional dominance in European waters, forcing British planners to rethink how and where their power was deployed. Naval strategy became the clearest expression of this shift. Britain began concentrating its most powerful fleets closer to home, particularly in the North Sea. To do so safely, it needed confidence that its interests elsewhere, especially in the Western Hemisphere, would not be left exposed. Increasingly, that confidence rested on the United States. There was no treaty announcing this change, and no public declaration of partnership. Instead, an informal understanding took shape. British naval forces gradually withdrew from the Caribbean, while American naval presence expanded into the space they left behind. On maps, the shift was subtle but decisive. British ships moving east toward Europe, American ships filling the Atlantic routes closer to home. This realignment worked because it aligned with the instincts of both governments. Britain accepted that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere was inevitable and, if cooperative, strategically useful. The United States framed its growing naval power as stabilizing rather than confrontational, avoiding challenges to British interests elsewhere. Leadership mattered. In Washington, President Theodore Roosevelt believed power should be exercised visibly but cautiously. He admired British naval professionalism and saw no advantage in provoking rivalry where cooperation served American interests better. In London, this approach was reassuring. American expansion no longer looked reckless, it looked predictable. By the time Europe began moving toward war, Britain and the United States were already operating in parallel. They were not formal allies, but they had stopped planning against each other. Their strategies now assumed restraint on the other side, a quiet but decisive break from the past. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, Britain and the United States faced the same crisis from different positions. Britain entered immediately, bound by treaty and by the strategic necessity of preventing a hostile power from dominating the continent. The United States declared neutrality, reflecting public opinion and a long tradition of avoiding European entanglements. On paper, the two nations were not aligned. In practice, neutrality proved porous. American industry and agriculture became indispensable to the Allied war effort. British ships carried American goods across the Atlantic, while American banks extended credit that kept Britain's economy functioning under the strain of war. Commerce and finance pulled the United States closer to Britain, even as diplomacy held it back. German strategy accelerated that convergence. Submarine warfare targeted shipping indiscriminately, blurring the line between neutral and belligerent. American vessels were sunk, American lives were lost, and the principle of free trade at sea, central to American power, came under direct attack. Each incident made neutrality harder to defend. The accumulation mattered more than any single event. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram revealed an attempt to draw Mexico into the conflict, the strategic stakes became unavoidable. A German victory would upend the balance of power that had quietly favored American security for decades. Britain's survival was no longer a distant concern. It was directly tied to American interests. In 1917, the United States entered the war not as Britain's former rival, but as its essential partner. The decision was framed in moral language, but it rested on strategic necessity. The two nations now faced the same threat, and neutrality no longer protected American power. When American forces arrived in Europe, they did more than reinforce the battlefield. They confirmed a reality that had been forming for decades. War between Britain and the United States was no longer conceivable. Under the pressure of global conflict, alignment ceased to be informal. It became structural, reshaping the relationship in ways that could not be reversed when the guns fell silent. The end of the First World War did not suddenly make Britain and the United States friends. There were no celebrations of shared identity, no declarations that history had been overcome. In fact, many of the old irritations resurfaced almost immediately. The United States withdrew from European political commitments, rejected permanent alliances, and insisted that Britain and its allies repay wartime debts. Resentment followed on both sides. What did not return was the expectation of conflict. Before the war, disagreement had always carried the shadow of escalation. After 1918, that shadow was gone. Too much had been proven, and too much had been risked together. War between Britain and the United States no longer appeared as a tool of policy. It appeared as a strategic absurdity. During the war, cooperation had become routine. British and American navies coordinated across the Atlantic. Financial systems intertwined to sustain the war effort. Military planning aligned toward shared objectives. These habits did not vanish with peace. They reshaped how both governments thought about power, security, and survival in a world that had grown far more dangerous. For Britain, the war confirmed that American power was not merely influential, but decisive. Britain could not preserve its global position without accounting for American interests. For the United States, the war demonstrated that Britain's survival mattered directly to its own security. A hostile Europe dominated by a single power was no longer tolerable. and Britain had been the barrier preventing that outcome. The rivalry that once defined their relationship did not end with reconciliation. It ended because it no longer served either side. Economic interdependence, strategic alignment, and shared experience had removed the incentives for hostility. What remained was not sentiment, but structure. By the early 20th century, the question of when Britain and America stopped hating each other had already answered itself. Not in a single moment, and not by agreement, but through decades of decisions that made conflict unnecessary, impractical, and finally unthinkable.